I'm going to share with you my screen. I don't normally do that when I preach, but today has some illustrations that I would like you to see. Our words for the day are constellation, configuration, and construct. All right, I'm going to say them again. Constellation, configuration, and construct. So I want you to think about your favorite constellation. Does anybody have a favorite constellation? Interesting. Well, the reason I wanted to ask you that is that constellations are constructs. So I want to ask you this question. Do you think that the stars know they're in a constellation? Probably not. I see many of you shaking your head. So we're going to put a pin in that for a second, and then I want to read you a passage of scripture that I think is going to help us today. It comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 10, starting in verse 1. Paul is writing, "By the humility and gentleness of Christ, I appeal to you. I, Paul, who am, quote, timid, unquote, when face to face with you, but, quote, bold, unquote, towards you when we went away, I beg you that when I come, I may not have to be as bold as I expect to be towards some people who think that we live by the standards of this world. For though we live in the world, we don't wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ." Paul had an idea, not just that the world was full of violence and contention, but that the stratified or structured nature of these conflicts meant that we had to fight them in a different way. And one of the things, besides love, one of the weapons that we fight our war with is not physical violence, but understanding in a way that leads people out of their conception of things, let's call it a constellation of ideas, into a different understanding that opens up possibilities for connectedness, okay? So I think that Paul, if he were around in the age of Black Lives Matters, would try and not argue with people, but try and open up ways of understanding so that we talked about the shape of race. This is our idea, my idea for the day I want to present to you, the shape of race. I've been watching the highlights of the Democratic National Convention this week, and I've noticed that Democrats are very comfortable using phrases like systemic racism and implicit bias that people from other political persuasions may find confusing or alienating or unattractive, maybe even confusing to the part of you don't know what it means. You think you keep throwing that word around. I don't even know what you're talking about. I, as an individual, am not a racist. So one of the things that I have found useful in helping people come to understand the role that we play in whether it's constellations of the way we interact as society or the way that we are configured as a culture is understanding that you're not just an individual, but that you're actually part of something much bigger. And the analogy that I have found that's really helpful, and I want to show you, I've got some visual illustrations today. If you are somebody who thinks primarily as an individual, you might think that all the W's form a W, and all the O's form an O, and all the R's form an R, and all the D's form a D. And when you put them together, that's how you have a word, right? That's a straightforward understanding of how the individual component parts are configured together, and then they form a construct called a word. And all the W's play their W role, and all the O's play their O role, and all the R's play their R role, and all the D's play their D role. And one of the reasons that that's a powerful, simple, straightforward understanding is if you were to say, I'm not a racist, right? I'm a W, I'm in the big W. And then you would say, well, where does racism come from? Racism comes from the R's. who are all configured in this constellation called an R, and that's where the racism comes from. So what I want to present to you is something it's a step removed from that, but it starts with this question. What do you do if you're part of an S that forms the shape of an H, or you're part of an H that forms the shape of an S? That seems inconsistent. And it can be very confusing to think, but I'm an S. I'm an S. I shouldn't be blamed for the H. You say, yes, you are an S, but you are a part of a constellation, a configuration that forms an H. So when you believe yourself to be an individual, one of the things that can be really confusing is to understand how your individual part, what role that plays in the much bigger fabric, how we are tied together. If you are an H, that you are in the shape of an A, it can be very disorienting to think, but I'm not an A. I'm not an A. I'm actually anti-A. But the reality is that you are part of something that is A. Or you might say, I'm a triangle. And so when you are part of a triangle that forms a bigger triangle, the world makes sense. But when you're part of a triangle that ends up forming a sphere, like on the right side of this screen, that can be very disorienting and even disappointing. So the thing I have found most useful is to use the analogy of a quilt. Because a quilt is constructed, but it's in a specific configuration. In that sense, it's like a constellation. And the individual parts of the quilt may not even know they're part of the constellation, or they may not have a really good grasp of what square they play. So if you're a triangle that forms a square when put together with other triangles, it may be really difficult to then imagine the whole fabric of the quilt and to accept the fact that my triangleness is somehow configured in a way that constructs a square fabric. This is why the defense of I'm not racist doesn't mean that much. So here's what I have found really useful is to say to people, bravo, good job. Good job not being racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever it is that we're talking about. Good job. But just understand that while you individually may not be, you are part of a much bigger construction, and the way that we are all knitted together, that constellation, right? That's the thing that's racist or sexist or homophobic. You are playing your part, but we are caught up into, we are knitted or woven into a much bigger fabric, and it's the fabric that we're worried about. So we actually need you, since you're so unracist, we actually need you to help us address the larger issue of the constellation and the way that we are knitted together as a society or a culture. And by doing this, to help people realize the role that they play in the bigger configuration is to free them of the misconception that all A's form an A and all B's form a B. But you can form triangles into spheres. You can form B's into the letter H. It's not about you. It's about this much bigger thing that we are a part of. And so it does us no good to clash in an argument culture, flesh on flesh, argument on argument, fight fire with fire. That's the weapons of the world. It's only by removing ourselves and going up one level to say, it's not about you. It's about how we all are knit together as a fabric of society. That's the concern and what we want to address. So what I'm going to do is have Joy sing for us while we think a little bit, and then we're going to come to the table and talk about this, okay? Joy, will you sing for us?